Hello, dear viewers, and welcome to a new edition of our program, Africa Today. Egypt's trade exchange with the African countries reached $2.117 billion in the first quarter of the year 2023. The top five markets for exports to Africa were Libya, Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, while the construction materials were Egypt's main exports to the African markets. More details with Samah Sharif.
The Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, CAPMAS, indicated in a report that Egypt's exports to Africa dropped by 5% in the first quarter of 2023 compared to the same period last year, while imports rose by 3%. Speaking of exports, they fell from $531.4 million to $504.2 million, with the top importer being Kenya with $67.2 million, down from $91.6 million, followed by South Africa with $17.4 million, down from $30.3 million, and Ethiopia with $1.7 million, down from $2.6 million. As for imports, they increased to $1.656 billion, up from $1.6 billion, with the top exporter being Kenya with $83.2 million, down from $97 million, followed by South Africa with $28 million, up from $21.2 million.
To shed more light on the issue, we are joined over the phone by Mr. Raouf Ghaffar, our economic expert. Mr. Ghaffar, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
How are you, sir?
Good.
Sir, how important is it for Egypt to boost the trade exchange with Africa?
To boost?
Yes, the trade exchange with Africa.
First of all, Africa is the continent where Egypt exists. Mm-hmm. Egypt is a very important and pivotal country in Africa. Mm-hmm. Egypt history assumed a lot of responsibility towards all African states, whether Arab states or others, without exception. And it is imperative for Egypt to strengthen its ties on all levels with all African countries, especially, as a matter of fact, it has been doing that for ages, but especially now, with all the challenges and with all the crises that are facing and happening all over the world. So it is important for Egypt to be there and to be always available to help and to cooperate with all Africa.
Yes. Sir, the Egyptian trade exchange with the African countries reached $2.117 billion in the Q1 of the year 2023. How do you read this number, and do we expect to witness more increase in this number by the end of the year?
Absolutely. This number is only to get higher. I mean, we have been, as I said, strengthening our ties, commercial ties. We have been involved in so many groupings, like the COMESA and others. We have been part of the agreements that are signed, free trade agreement and free transit. I mean, anything to do with getting African states closer one to another. Egypt is participating. Africa for Egypt represents a very lucrative market for everything, whether products, whether investments, whether establishing industries, etc. Africa is the future for Egypt, and Africa is the future for the whole world. So it is very, not very, it is for sure. This number you have mentioned is on the way up, and we will not be surprised if this figure is doubled in the very, very near future, and even more.
Yes. Sir, actually, according to the chairman of the General Organization for Exports and Import Control, actually the top 5 markets for export to Africa were Libya, Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, which are all Arab African countries. Why is that from your point of view?
The relation between Egypt and the Arab states is eternal. So it is no surprise that the Arab African countries should be the top of the list. But according to what we experienced lately, and with the Egyptian companies working in different African states, what have you, I expect, and with the agreements that we just mentioned a few minutes ago, I expect that a lot of African countries will be on the list, and maybe 1 or 2 of them might surpass the few Arab countries that you just mentioned.
Indeed, Mr. Ghaffar, also the construction materials were Egypt's main exports to the African markets, followed by the chemicals and fertilizers and foodstuffs. How do you see the importance of varying exports to the African markets?
I mean, you mentioned very important and strategic products. As I mentioned, Africa is the market for a lot of Egyptian products, and I don't want to stop at exporting, but I want to add, maybe we can establish cooperation with companies of these countries, and we establish industries for mutual benefit there. We can export manpower within the context of executing different mega projects, which we have started already. I mean, our presence in Africa has been for 60 years and more, and we have been absent, yes, from the African market for some time, but lately President Sisi thought well of going back to Africa, and he did a beautiful comeback. And I am sure that, as I said, we will not stop at exporting products, but we will continue cooperating with the African countries on anything we can make with mutual benefit.
Yes. Sir, how have the challenges like the coronavirus pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian war highlighted the need for closer African trade ties?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a lesson that we have taught. We were taught a lesson from the crises that happened, leading toward one thing. We have to depend on ourselves as much as possible. We have to lessen the dependence on other countries, especially for food and health. And these are the 2 main things that we feel are getting much, much better. And remember during the COVID crisis, when there was a lack of vaccines and Egypt went in, importing vaccines for the African poor countries, by manufacturing vaccines under licensing Egypt to cover the African market, by inciting the financial institutions to increase their finances to supply the vaccines to different countries. This was on this side. When, of course, the provision chains were interrupted after the Ukraine-Russian war, Egypt tried to supply as much as possible food and other stuff to African countries who suffered most from this interruption of chains of supplies, and this is the way to complement. I mean, complementing each other, integration with the whole Africa is a must in the coming future.
Indeed, sir. Actually, Egypt is a signatory to several trade agreements among the African countries, including the African Continental Free Trade Area and the Common Markets for the Eastern and Southern Africa. How have these blocks actually contributed to boosting the African trade from your point of view, Mr. Ghaffar?
They are extremely important, and they broaden the economic relations between the different countries by facilitating the movement of people and goods from one country to the other, by creating new maritime lines to join the countries that are overlooking seas and oceans. Any agreement signed helps toward the integration of the continent. Mind you, Egypt has not failed, and I'm sure we will always be part of any grouping or any agreement or any accord to be signed leading to the better of the African continent.
Indeed, Mr. Raouf Ghaffar, our economic expert. Thank you so much, sir, for your precious input. Always a pleasure. And moving on with this report from Sudan, where calls for sanctions against Sudan are mounting amid the genocide warnings in Darfur region. Actually, the Rapid Region support forces have been fighting the Sudanese army for control of the country in the capital Khartoum, while it has been accused of waging a separate war in Darfur. More details in the following report.
British MPs have been warned of the possibility of genocide in the Darfur region of Sudan and urged to put pressure on the Rapid Support Forces RSF paramilitary group, which has been accused of murder and arson attacks on minority groups in the area. While the RSF has been fighting the Sudanese army for control of the country in the capital Khartoum, it has been accused of waging separate war in Darfur, where the Janjaweed militias from which the RSF was formed were accused of genocide almost 20 years ago. A UN employee who escaped the Janjaweed said the war in Khartoum is totally different from in Darfur. He said the war in Darfur is the Janjaweed attacking innocent people sitting in their own villages. It was, he said, a continuation of the war that started in 2003. The RSF leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hamidti, has since accumulated military and financial power from gold mines he controls in Darfur, which mostly supply the United Arab Emirates. As well as fighting in El Geneina area, the RSF has been accused of targeting the Masalit ethnic group. The UN said at the weekend it had received testimony of summary executions and persistent violence over the course of last week, accompanied by hate speech calling for the Masalit to be killed and expelled from Sudan. On Wednesday, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders said 7 activists had been killed in El Geneina over the past month. All had reportedly received threats from militias before their deaths. Satellite imagery shows a 0.7 square kilometers area that has been destroyed in El Geneina. According to UNICEF, 140,000 Sudanese refugees have arrived in Chad since April.
Libya's Tripoli-based government rejected the claims of involvement in drone strikes in the east. Earlier, the news websites attributed to the attack to the armed forces of the unrecognized government in Tripoli. More details follow.
The Tripoli-based Libyan government denied any involvement in drone strikes against a base used by the Russian paramilitary group Wagner that had been reported by a military source in the eastern camp of the divided country. The military source, who requested anonymity, said that drone strikes of unknown origin had targeted the Al-Kharouba air base on Thursday evening, 150 kilometers southeast of Benghazi in the east, where elements of the Wagner group are believed to be based. News websites attributed the attack to the armed forces of the UN-recognized government in Tripoli, whose legitimacy is disputed by the rival camp in eastern Libya. Libya has been in the grip of a major political crisis since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in 2011, undermined by divisions between East and West and foreign interference. From April 2019 to June 2020, Khalifa Haftar, the strong man of Libya's eastern camp, used Chadian, Sudanese, Nigerian and Syrian fighters, but above all mercenaries from Wagner, in his failed attempt to seize the capital Tripoli. This failure was followed in October 2020 by a ceasefire agreement, compliance with which is supervised by a military commission comprising 5 officers from each side. Since then, hundreds of Wagner members have remained active in the east, in the area of the oil terminals and in the south of Libya after some of their troops left for Mali or Ukraine to fight alongside the Russian army.
And with this, our dear viewers, we come to the end of this edition of our program, Africa Today. Till tomorrow with another great goodbye.